Today, I am so honored and excited to introduce Professor Zubok, and he's a professor of international history and with expertise on the Cold War, the Soviet Union, Stalinism, and the Russia's intellectual history in the 21st centuries. Professor Zubok was born and educated in Moscow, and he studied for his undergraduate degree at the Moscow State University and studied for his PhD at the Institute for the USA and Canada in Moscow. Of course, and his latest book, which I adore the most, it's called Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union. Professor Zubok, and welcome to the Missing Piece.
Good to be with you, Will.
Now, Professor, let's get started. Normally with the first question is, what was your motivation to write this book, and how useful is it today to understand today's geopolitical shift?
Well, I should add to what you said so kindly about my biography. I have a most unusual biography, maybe unusual in the old days, more usual today. I'm a migrant. I was born in the Soviet Union. I was who I was, as I said, but then I moved to the West after the Soviet collapse. And the Soviet collapse was the moment when I was literally in midair and later landing in New York and reading the New York Times about Gorbachev being arrested and the Soviet Union in crisis. That was 1991. And 30 years later, I'm professor of the London School of Economics. Of course, we face different era, different crises. And when I finished my book in the summer of previous year, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict was already quite visible for the entire world. And of course, when I put the last touches on my book, I had in my mind this question: what is the current geopolitical relevance of my book? Is it just about the predetermined Soviet disintegration, or when many people told me, why are you spending so many years researching this question, the answer to which is so manifestly clear? The Soviet Union, those people said, was a communist totalitarian monstrosity. It was the empire of nations. So the moment Gorbachev found political courage to open the door, all those nations broke loose and the Soviet Union ignominiously collapsed. Well, I spent indeed many, many years working in the archives and interviewing many participants, and this is not the story I discovered. This is the story what people want to hear about, and that's what the story that fits into their pre-existing concept of the nice Western-centered world where liberalism is the only viable ideology, as Frank Fukuyama told us long ago. And this is, I'm afraid, no longer the world we're facing today. So I wanted to tell the real story of the collapse, where, that was a perfect storm, where the Soviet Union not only confronted the structural problems inherited, since Stalin and Lenin, but the Soviet Union fell victim to a strange leadership, or sometimes lack of leadership, to financial crisis, where the leadership lost control of the national currency, the ruble, and indeed confronted nationalism in a big way, confronted secessionist movements, but most extraordinarily confronted the secession of the core people of the Soviet Union, the Russians themselves. And that was one of the most surprising questions. Why the Russians themselves turned against what in the West was called their own empire.
That's right.
For the West, the Soviet Union was Russia, and all of a sudden, in this kind of split of mind, Russians turned against themselves. And that made my book the most unpredictable and fascinating journey through 2 or 3 years of history, completely unknown for the West.
Professor Zubok, when we talk about the Soviet Union, it's so interesting that just given by the title, The Collapse of the Soviet Union, it's so interesting that we know that back in the days, when I was a student in high school, when we heard about this country, Soviet Union, naturally that we will link with the former US President Ronald Reagan. Of course, that remember, not only he was a great speaker, but also he was really firm on dealing with international crisis. However, in the book, or in your perspective, Ronald Reagan was not the groundbreaker, was not really the true engine to break the Soviet Union. So can you help us to understand what indeed made the Soviet Union collapse? And I mean, again, what was the common misunderstanding from the American side?
Well, I know this is a great American myth that Ronald Reagan ended the Cold War because he was so tough.
That's right.
On communism, so uncompromising to the Soviet Union. And what Americans prefer to remember is the early Reagan. Reagan that gave new hope to America. He was not Trump, of course, but he was a pre-Trumpian kind of leader who turned to Americans after the period of the 70s when, inflation was high. Nobody knew what is American mission in the world after the loss of Vietnam, defeat in Vietnam. And Reagan told Americans, we're a great nation.
That's right.
By the way, we'll face down communism, and, we should be the primary leader of the free world. And all this great rhetoric. He was a great communicator. What people don't remember, of course, that Reagan changed fundamentally after assassination attempt on his life. In 83, 84, he began to write personal and handwritten letters to the Soviet leadership, trying to find a pretext to meet with them. So in his mind, the United States reached the pinnacle of power again. It was strong enough to talk to the communists. And also in his mind, Reagan made a distinction already, he didn't do it before, between the Russians and the communists. In his mind before, Russians were all communists. Then, somebody told him, oh no, Russians are great people. They're proud of their history, a long history, 1,000 years, and great culture, by the way. So that late Reagan reached out to Gorbachev, and there are plenty of books about him and Gorbachev taking important steps to rebuild trust and finish the Cold War. But back to my story, I don't think, first of all, I think that this is a great story, but it was told before in so many books. My book is not about the end of the Cold War. It's not about this narrative. The Cold War, as most people believe, ended or began to end most dramatically when the wall fell. This is such a symbol of ending the Cold War kind of moment, and that's November 1989. My book is about two subsequent years, from November 1989 to December 1991. And in Western and world imagination, because the world imagination depends so much on Western media and the way people communicate to you narratives in English. This is what we have. We have US currency, dollar, to be the world currency, and Western media, to English media, American media, become the global media. So, okay, in this media, pretty much nothing happened in the Soviet Union between November 89 and 91. It just collapsed. So you find any book describing in great detail how Reagan and Gorbachev, blah, 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 ended the Cold War. And then, you read further, and then probably in conclusion, probably 2-3 lines are written. And then the Soviet Union, for some reason, collapsed at the end of the story. As if this collapse was a necessary and essential consequence of the end of the Cold War. And my book says absolutely not. Nobody imagined that the Soviet Union would fall apart in early 1990. And even at the end of 1990, when many people inside the Soviet Union already realized, hey, we have this huge crisis, financial crisis of faith to political leadership, secessionism of republics, violence in republics, even at that time, the majority of the people could not simply imagine that within 1 year they would become citizens of 15 independent states. That was unimaginable. So, responding to Reagan cult,
Right.
I respect this phenomenon. I know that the name recognition is immense. Gorbachev is usually remembered as Reagan's partner, ending the Cold War. People argue who did most in this story.
That's right.
Those who don't dislike Reagan, by the way, they always opt for Gorbachev. They always say, "Oh, it was Gorbachev, not Reagan, that ended the Cold War." It's not my story at all. My story is what happened after this.
Professor Zubok, it's so interesting that, again, you mentioned in your book that you took on a factual but a brand new approach to help readers and help the audience to understand the facts behind the collapse of the Soviet Union. But, interestingly, that I remember before introducing your book to the friends around me, when I say, hey, let's get a copy of this book, or let's talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, one country that most people are more likely to relate it to is the country of China. And so that's why I want to know that with the ongoing matter under Gorbachev, and of course that, Reagan, he was very, very resentful towards the growth of communism. And so I want to know that was there any correlation between Soviet Union and China back in the days, just pre the collapse?
Well, there's enormous resonance. I'm not sure about correlation. When we say correlation, we have to put a political science cap, analyze and quantify and whatnot. This is not my way, by the way. But resonance, when we say something and that resonates, it means that in China, many educated people who know history, particularly recent history of China, of course, realized very well that after 1949, the Chinese People's Republic of China was modeled to a great extent on the country they admired, the Soviet Union. And Soviet advisors were there. Later on, they left in 1960, but they did a lot to build up Chinese educational system, science, all the way, industries, and all the way to the Chinese nuclear program. It's all well known. Now, we also know that despite all the tension and later reconciliation, the Chinese always paid special attention to the northern neighbor for various historical reasons. And when the Soviet Union suddenly collapsed, and I'm not a sinologist, I'm not an expert, but I read enough to see that for China it came as a huge jolt, a huge shock. And the soul searching began at the very top of the country's elite inside the Communist Party. Can it happen to us as well? Because we have been modeled so much on the Soviet Union. We also have minorities. We also have all kinds of other problems. Are we doomed to collapse in the same way as the Soviet Union? Fortunately for China, it took a very successful road to modernization and so on and so forth. But I still see, and in my Chinese students and in various Chinese experts that I encountered, there's some sense of deep unease. Even with enormous success, economic success, there's still kind of a worm of doubt inside this. What about our international legitimacy? What about if we become the next object of American suspicion and a new Cold War, as for instance today? All these things are almost under the radar of Chinese consciousness, and this explains to me why so many Chinese, and I hope they will, read my books before, such as The Failed Empire, for instance, was translated into Chinese, and hopefully will read my new book, because it's not exactly what will happen to China. It's not. But it's a useful kind of parallel world with many things that resonate with you and with your experience. Communism, ideology, one-party rule, minorities, problems of potential secession, and so on and so forth.
Professor Zubok, again, going back to the conversation we had before, in terms of communicating with the Chinese audience, and as much as they are familiar with the name Reaganism, I consider that Ronald Reagan was just not only the president for America, but also he actually made the trip to China during his presidency. He made a great appearance with the Chinese audience and communicated with Chinese youth in terms of, introducing the idea of democracy and understanding this, the bounding relationship between these two countries. But meanwhile, if I'm not mistaken, historically speaking, when Ronald Reagan actually made his trip to China, some of the students challenged him in terms of understand another leader that Professor Zubok, you mentioned previously, is the Gorbachev. And we know that based on your book or based on your research, that Gorbachev was trying to dismantle the entire system of Stalinism. Now, the question to you is, help us to understand what was Gorbachev was actually trying to accomplish in terms of shaping his policy back in the days, and how much did his leadership impact on the people back in the days?
Well, very simple. When Gorbachev became the leader, the Soviet Union was in a state of stasis. It looked like an immutable construction, and so rigid, so difficult to change. After all these years, particularly under previous leadership, that sort of ruled and died, being in the Kremlin. So it looks immutable. And when Gorbachev started his reforms, I guess, he had a few assumptions. First, that, Stalinist system that persisted to an extent in the Soviet Union until 1985, when he became the leader, that this system outlived its whatever purpose it had. It had many negative purposes like terror, gulag, and all these things we remember. But, in the eyes of some, it had positive purposes, like, for instance, mobilization of resources to ensure the country's security, such as building, nuclear parity with the United States of America, despite the fact that the Soviet Union economically was many times weaker and smaller than the United States. That was regarded as a great achievement in the 50s, when Gorbachev was young. But by the time he became the leader, people wanted something different. People wanted better living standards, consumer goods, cleaner environment, and yes, more civil rights, less oppressive and depressive political regime. And Gorbachev did grow with everyone who thought the same. Yes, we may have reached that moment when we need to move along this front, reforms. When he started, however, had no clue how these reforms can be executed. And, it's surprising from a perspective of a Marxist-Leninist ideology. You start with what? You start with political reforms or economic reforms. It's not quite clear. Lenin would say, Lenin would have said, let's seize power, and then we built a new economy and a new society because we are in power. Marx would have said, oh, no, you have to wait until economy, reaches certain level and people and so on and so forth. So those two trends revolved, around what Gorbachev should do. And I think he ultimately decided, let's tried to change economy. He started early in 1987, 88. And unfortunately, this reform was not to take a step towards a market economy, but to decentralize the existing economy, which were two disastrous and counterproductive results when instead of creating a new viable economy based, I don't know, on profit, efficiency, competition, all those things under the state control. It could have been done under the state control, but opening up to the world as it was later in China. But instead of, he decentralized the old one and created a lot of corruption, and people simply began to steal, to hollow up the existing economy without creating new goods. And the most the favorite thing for the so-called Soviet business under late Gorbachev was what? To take state oil at state prices, get a license to sell it abroad at world prices, and pocket the currency and pocket the profit without paying taxes. So a lot of the schemes were created under Gorbachev. Then pretty soon it became clear that this economic perestroika is failing. Then Gorbachev said, oh, well, if it's failing, it must be because the communist apparatus stands in the way. This communist so-called red aristocracy, I know in China they use this expression, red nomenclatura in the Soviet Union. Let's remove this from equation and let people decide and create multi-layered representative institutions like Lenin used to do in the past, Soviets, councils. And he began to do it in 1989, and it turned out to be the next phase of disaster because there was nothing on the shelves. In China, by the way, economy already began to fill the shelves for the Chinese. Prices went up, and that created discontent, but there were goods. Right. In the Soviet Union, discontent came from the absence of goods, and in this bad economic situation when people grumbled about everything economic, to open up the room for political discussion would be automatically to invite political populism, economic populism, all kinds of demagogues, and yes, nationalists who would say immediately, the Soviet Union is a failing project, it's a failing state. Let's just create independent states on the basis of 15 republics that constitute the Union. So right away, Gorbachev exacerbated economic problems, and then instead of dealing with this economic problem, changing the course, he opened up political arena. Well, I love democracy and civil rights myself, and at the time, as a young man, I applauded Gorbachev. We were allowed many, many things that we didn't have before. Life was looking up politically, very much brighter, much more interesting. Demonstrations, free and freer press, fascinating reading everywhere. But economy was going south. So in my book, I write, Gorbachev was a hapless captain who thought that he was steering the Soviet ship westward, but in fact it was going south, that is, down.